I'm jealous. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. Apologies for a couple minutes of late start here. Technical difficulties has been the name of the game, but I'm Jess Behrens. I am a social worker and I am the program manager at the St. Cloud VA Caregiver Support Program. I have been with the Caregiver Support Program for about 12 years and with VA for almost 14 at this point. And so what I am here to talk about today is understanding the caregiver experience, which is a kind of an overview that VA has put together with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, which is an advocacy organization that works with military caregiver families in particular, to look at kind of what a common caregiver experience might look like. And this was built through lots and lots of interviews and conversations with caregivers, specifically caregivers of veterans. So I will throw that in there. You'll see in my PowerPoint, a lot of times it talks about caring for veterans, the veterans treatment team, but it is really translatable to you know, non-veteran situations. So we're going to go through this a little bit. I do have to start with some, oops, that's okay. I have to press this to advance. This one to advance here. This one to advance here. All right. We will see how well I can multitask. All right, so my standard disclosures. First of all, I want to offer acknowledgement for Tricia Chaddock and Leah Christensen, who are both social workers at our National VA Program Office, or VA Caregiver Support Program Office, excuse me. I have adapted most of this material from a presentation that they put together with their permission, but this is really great information, so I have to acknowledge them. I do want to say I have no personal financial relationship with any of the with any commercial interest. Oh, I think we have open mics. Mute quick. Okay. So no financial interests. I'm not getting any money for this. And then I have to, okay, so here's my standard VA disclosure. The content of this presentation is for information only and does not represent the views of the Department of Veterans Affairs or the United States government. Any unauthorized disclosure, reproduction, dissemination, or distribution of the communication in the presentations without the author's consent is prohibited. I've said that a few times in my career. All right, so our objectives today. I want to go through the caregiver journey map and talk about that because we're going to look at what key caregiver experiences throughout that caregiver journey map look like. Now, how many of you are caregivers here? Okay, and yeah, absolutely.
Because I have 52 of them, so yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say this is, you know, it's a broad overview. Hi, come on in. So it is a broad overview of caregiving. It's probably going to seem pretty familiar to a lot of you. Some of these things are going to be like, yeah, absolutely, I experienced that. And some are going to be like, what in the world are you talking about? That's ridiculous. So these are kind of generalizations. We're going to talk about the impact of caregiving on caregivers. Just again, it's going to be something that probably sounds really familiar to those of you who are in caregiving roles. But I think it's important to acknowledge that and to validate what those experiences look like. And we'll kind of skip through referring caregivers to VA Caregiver Support Program, because if it's anything like last time, I will probably run way to the end and not have time to do that. So I will make sure to tell you how to get that information should you need it. All right, so we'll start with the caregiver journey. Now, this on your screen is the military and veteran caregiver experience map. I know you can't read it, neither can I. This is, I just kind of want to give you the general visual of what this looks like. The website up here at the top, caregiverjourney.elizabethdolefoundation.com or .org, excuse me, you can find a whole interactive copy of this map. So you can see all of the little pieces, bits and pieces that are in there. We'll talk about some of the broader themes, but if you want to take a look at this, it's actually a great tool, especially if you work with other caregivers at all. There is also on that website a little video that's called "What is the Caregiver Journey Map?" I'm not going to show it here, just it's not necessary. Basically reiterates what I'm just going to tell you now. So. Okay, so again, I know you can't really see this. It's more for looking pretty than anything else. The first step, actually, I'm going to back up just a little bit before I move forward. I want to be really clear that as we're talking about this, we see it broken up into 3 primary sections, right? We've got becoming aware and adjusting. We talk about as the first section, shifting priorities and seeking help as the second, and finding a rhythm as the third section there. Now, there's a reason we do this as a wheel. Our map is a wheel. It is not linear because, like stages of grief, you're going to kind of move around within this experience. So you might be finding a rhythm and then all of a sudden something happens, kind of bumps you back to becoming aware and adjusting to that new situation. You can move back, forward, in and out, upside down, hokey pokey throughout this whole process. And I'm probably speaking to the choir about that. But what we will do is we will talk about these in what we see as kind of a typical quote unquote journey, just because otherwise it would get really confusing if I didn't have some sort of process to go through this. So becoming aware and adjusting. This is when a caregiver starts to recognize that they are moving into a caregiver role. The first thing, of course, is starting to notice changes in the veteran's health or behavior. Now, again, veteran, that's just the language I'm used to using. Doesn't have to be a veteran. This can be something that either happens really abruptly. So like it might be something like an accident or a stroke or a heart attack that one day that individual is fine and independent and the next day they are needing a lot of support. Or it could be something that happens more gradually, like a chronic illness or, dementia or something like that, where it's not really just one day that suddenly you realize that you're providing that extra care. It's more of a gradual realization until you get to this point where you're like, wow, things are really different than they were. I'm doing a whole heck of a lot more than I thought I was doing before. So whether that's an abrupt thing or whether it's a gradual thing, this piece is all about when you start recognizing that and start becoming aware of it. And that's the point where you start reacting and responding to some of those changes as well that happen as part of the caregiving role. And starting to identify as a caregiver. For those of you who are caregivers, how long did it take you to start thinking, yeah, I'm a caregiver?
A while.
Yeah. Took a lot of times to be like, oh, this is more than just supporting my spouse or my parent or even the next door neighbor who I care a whole lot about, right? So beginning to identify as a caregiver, that's a big piece of the change as well. Because until you start to kind of have some of that recognition, whether you call yourself a caregiver or not, it's hard to get any of the resources or supports that you need if you're not feeling like that's part of your role, right? So becoming aware and adjusting. With each of these pieces, I'm going to talk a little bit about both the key caregiver experiences that were reported as part of this study that the Elizabeth Dole Foundation and VA did, as well as what the needs are that those caregivers oftentimes reported. We use this map, I should just say, both to help caregivers recognize and understand their own journey or what their journey may look like, but also to provide a lot of education to professionals as well, to talk about what do our caregivers need? What are they saying that they need? Because honestly, when you're in the moment, you might be saying, I have no idea what I need. I have no idea what I need. It might be months down the line before you're like, man, I could have used XYZ at that moment. So some of the key caregiver experiences that are reported are feeling pressure to take on extra responsibilities and experiencing difficulty focusing on your day-to-day life as a part of that. So this is where some changes start to happen in your quote unquote regular life. And so trying to keep track of the things that you do as part of your regular routine in the context of starting to take on all of these additional responsibilities, whether it's just a little bit right now or whether it's suddenly a whole flood of things, that's a hard balance to find. Experiencing overwhelming uncertainty and stress. What do we do from here? What is the next day, week, month, year going to look like? This, especially like if you're at a stage where you don't have a diagnosis or you don't have a care plan yet, that is something that we hear quite frequently, is that uncertainty and stress is part of this stage. Feeling trapped between seeking help and maintaining normalcy. I think it's really normal at this point to kind of want to put your head in the sand and be like, la, 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 I can't hear you, this isn't happening. And kind of have that, hold that hope that, you know, it might just go away. It might just stop. And for some people, maybe it is short term and it is going to kind of quote unquote go away, or the caregiving role will end. For a lot of folks, especially if we're looking at things like dementia, it's taking that step into recognizing that it's time to start looking for help, as opposed to just kind of hiding and sticking in your normal life, which honestly is a very natural response. That's a tough, again, another tough line to walk. Losing opportunities for contact with friends and family, as well as your community. And we hear a lot of caregivers say that they experience conflicting feelings of guilt and shame. Now, why would caregivers experience guilt or shame? Any thoughts? As someone who works with caregivers but has not been in a caregiver role myself, I want to be like, you have nothing to feel guilty about. You are doing an amazing thing. Even if it's not perfect, it's better than nothing. You are giving of yourself. This is an incredible thing that you're doing. But the caregivers I often hear are saying, you know what, but I'm feeling resentful of this. Or I said till death do us part, and, or, you know, till in sickness and in health, and boy, there's sickness now and I wish that I could just bail. And there's guilt that comes along with that. So that's a normal feeling. It's not saying that you have to feel that, but a lot of our caregivers acknowledge that that is a part of this part of the journey. So some of the things that they're saying that they are needing in this piece of the journey is to help start understanding what a caregiving journey looks like. So having this kind of information where you know you're not going to be at the crisis point forever and ever, that there are steps and there are things that you can do, and understand those pieces of things that you might need to start accessing. Opportunities for self-care and respite. This can be, well, this is a challenging one throughout the cycle, in both recognizing, bringing yourself to do that and to prioritize that, but also finding the logistical ability to do that, right? Having somebody who can come and provide respite, or seeing big nods, or even being like, you know what, taking 5 minutes to have some deep breaths is just, it's out of my bandwidth right now. I feel like I do not have the emotional capacity to take some deep breaths. Normal. However, what we encourage caregivers to do at this point is to start building that into their caregiving, even at this moment. They may not feel completely overwhelmed. They may not feel completely in crisis, or they may not start really feeling that overwhelming feeling that happens as you continue caregiving. However, the sooner you start working that into your routines, the easier it is to maintain. Access to community services and resources, emergency funding and grants. I worked a lot with caregivers of veterans who served after 9/11, so our veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of those families were very young, so we might have, you know, perhaps spouses in their mid-20s who are leaving the workforce because they now have to care for their veteran full-time, and now they've lost their income. Veteran might be eligible for disability, but that process takes a while to get through. And so there's pretty significant financial impacts. And it's certainly not, you know, specific to that younger group as well. All eras, you might see people leaving the workforce earlier, so maybe retiring earlier than they had planned. spending a lot of money out of pocket for medical appointments, for, personal care assistants, all that kind of thing. Caregiving is an expensive job to have, which is a terrible thing to have to say, but it is. So understanding where some of that emergency funding can come from. Figuring out if you are working, what is your flexibility within your work schedule? And then they also say, you know what, getting into counseling early is important. And that can take a lot of different forms, whether that's, individual counseling to support yourself and your own mental health, or, for example, if you're caring for your spouse, getting into some couples counseling, because that dynamic has changed a lot from just being a spouse to being a spouse and a caregiver. Changes that power dynamic, changes the way that you interact with each other, and counseling can sometimes help with that. Questions or comments on this first section? Okay. The second section that we have here is shifting priorities and seeking help. So this is kind of, you're starting to get your feet underneath you, and you're starting to kind of try and figure out, where do we go from here? What are the next steps? So developing a plan, starting to reach out for help, recognizing what kind of help might be needed. Okay, so key caregiver experiences during this piece. Experiencing changes in your day-to-day life. Now, this is, you're starting to kind of find out what those changes in day-to-day life are going to maybe look like on a longer term basis. Perhaps the initial first crisis has passed, and you're starting to figure out what it is going to look like moving forward from here. Caregivers often are picking up their management of the care plan at this point. An example might be if a veteran or care receiver, is perhaps they have a stroke and they're in the hospital for a while, and their care plan then includes going into maybe short-term rehab to get some skills back so that they can safely return to the home. And then after that, maybe they're returning to the home, perhaps with some home health aides for a short period of time. But with each of those step downs, the caregiver is starting to pick up more and more of the care plan, whether, that's helping to manage appointments, whether it's learning how to do the medications, whether it's actually doing the physical cares. That's starting to, the caregiver starting to pick more of that up, because it's moving away from the treatment team or the medical treatment team. Feeling frustrated by the complexity of healthcare systems. Has anybody experienced that in their caregiving journey? Yeah. Now I work for VA, which is admittedly a rather challenging system to navigate. I've been with the VA for 14 years, and I still sometimes don't understand how to navigate. I've had a number of people come and ask me today about eligibility, and I'm like, I'm going to direct you to an expert on that, because I would probably give you bad information. I can tell you broadly, but that's about it. But when you're just coming into that for the first time, and you're trying to navigate that, or even if you know it and now you're trying to navigate it in a completely new space as a caregiver, that's really, really frustrating. It's the last thing you need when you're already trying to figure out how to help your person, right? I think an example that I have of one of the first caregivers that I ever worked with when I came into my position called me, and she was so stressed out. She's absolutely lovely, but her husband, her veteran, had a stroke, and he was nonverbal. He was going to get better. He had some rehab recovery, but at the moment he was nonverbal. He had handled all his health care at the VA by himself. She'd never walked in the door. She'd never talked to a provider. And she said, I don't even know where to start. Like, I'm on his list as his emergency contact, but that's about as much impact or as much interaction as I have had with VA. So we had to kind of start navigating that system, figure out who she had to get in contact with to get the equipment that was needed for him to return home and that kind of thing. Now, VA is fortunate to have resources like caregiver support and our primary care social workers who can assist with things like that. And I encourage you, if you are getting frustrated, finding issues with the healthcare systems that you're working in, is to see if you can locate a social worker and see if they can help point you in the right direction of like a patient navigator or something like that. So, and also in addition to getting frustrated and trying to navigate healthcare systems, caregivers are trying to start figuring out what support organizations and resources in the community they might need. So maybe they're starting to, they're maybe making their first call to the Alzheimer's Association or Senior Linkage Line, or that caregiver support group that their friend at church told them about that been kind of hesitant to go to. Starting to recognize what those are and starting to reach out and seek help around that. And of course, there's lots of emotions at this point. There continue to be a lot of emotions. Guilt continues to be a recurring theme here. Disappointment that life has changed. Grief is a big piece of caregiving, unfortunately. I can't tell you how many caregivers I've had say to me, this is not how I expected my retirement to look. We're gonna travel all over the place and go visit grandkids or whatever. And now, unfortunately, because of my loved ones' physical abilities or cognitive abilities, we just can't do that as easily as we thought we could. So that's a normal sense of grief and disappointment. Pride in their ability to manage care. The recognition that there are things that you can do as caregivers, that you are an advocate, that you are learning things that are really challenging to do. That's worth taking pride in, and recognizing that there is skill required in that. But also still that uncertainty about the future our caregivers are reporting to. So what are they saying they need at these points? I kind of broke these into 3 different areas, but from a healthcare system perspective, our caregivers say that really being recognized as a member of the treatment team is critical at this point. Kind of a traditional medical model oftentimes is providers, doctors, primary care providers often really speak and work solely with the patient until they absolutely can't. So maybe they'll invite the caregiver or the family in there, but they're still going to be directing all of their questions at the patient, which is important. But as a caregiver, you have a lot of insight as well. And so caregivers were saying, we really want to make sure that we are included in those conversations, because after that, if we're lucky, 20-minute appointment that we have with the provider, we're the ones who have to go home and make that treatment plan work, that care plan work. And therefore, that clear communication with the primary care team and also with the loved one, the person that's being cared for. And then also having a diagnosis and a care plan. Anybody have challenges getting a diagnosis? Yeah. And that is part of what caregivers are saying is like, we need to understand what a diagnosis is. And now with, dementia, you're maybe not going to get a whole lot of, like, somebody's probably not going to be able to say you have Lewy body dementia versus frontotemporal dementia specifically, or they may not say that directly. But getting an idea about what is happening here, what's happening to my loved one, and how do we move forward with a care plan, what's that going to look like? That is something that caregivers are understandably reporting that they need. From a self-care perspective, getting some assistance with both the physical and emotional challenges of caregiving. So not just somebody who can come in and assist with bathing or dressing or getting the right kind of equipment in the home, but also getting that emotional support for yourself as a caregiver. And that can take a lot of different forms. It could take individual counseling. It could be groups. It could be just education. It could just be fellowship and talking with, your girlfriend at a coffee shop and having a chance to do that, or a phone call with your kids or something like that. But you need that support emotionally as well. Again, counseling, that's going to be a recurring theme that you'll see here. And training to manage the stress of caregiving. I mean, it's really common, I think, in our society to be like, oh, stress management. We should just all practice stress management, but we don't really talk about how to do that. Especially, we don't talk about how to do that when you don't have the time to do that. And that's the reason that you need the stress management, right? So caregivers, actually, you need to learn that and train in that and practice that in the same way that you would any other skill that you are learning. Logistics continue to be financial benefits, stuff around the workplace if you're looking at going back to work. Oh. And assistance from extended family as something as well. Questions or comments on shifting priorities and seeking help? Okay. Finding a rhythm. So this is the last third. It's not the last piece of it, but it's the last third of the circle that we have here that we're going to talk about today. Finding a rhythm is all about kind of getting out of survival mode and starting to figure out what your life might look like from day to day moving forward here. Establishing that new normal and figuring out, again, what's day to day going to look like? How do we cope with this? What do I need? Who do I reach out to? So finding a rhythm, key caregiver experiences. A lot of folks report feeling both uncertainty and hope about the future. So there's still a lot of questions. What's going to happen with my loved one's health? We know that if it's a chronic illness, that there may be changes down the line. If something gets worse, something gets better, something changes, something stops working. There's uncertainty there, but at the same point, there's also maybe some hope because we're recognizing that we don't have to live in this crisis place forever. That there's going to be some level of stability and we can start looking forward instead of just focusing on the right now. Caregivers report that at this stage, they're oftentimes having more of a reliable network that they can access support from. And again, that network can take a lot of different forms. It might be family, it might be a faith community, it might be friends, it might be a service organization that's working with you or a treatment team, but feeling like you've got more of a reliable network. Starting to recognize and witness those permanent changes that are being brought on by the care plan and how that's impacting your day-to-day and kind of adapting to that. And as a part of that, developing those new skills to face those challenges. It was mentioned, caregivers, you might now be learning how to fix the washing machine if it goes out because you were not the handy one before, but somebody's got to do it, right? I have had so many people tell me that. I will. Oh, gosh. Yeah. Yeah. So then you're kind of at that crisis point and it's like, well, what do I do now? Yeah. So learning those new skills, whether you want to or not. Yeah. Returning to self-care and personal hobbies. Now, I know this one maybe seems a little pie in the sky, like, when am I going to be able to do that? But, when you find a rhythm and it starts becoming a little bit easier to figure out what day-to-day is going to look like, if you have started to incorporate some of that in or have made that even kind of a mental priority, that'll be the time where you might be able to feel a little bit more capable of doing that on a regular basis and return to the things that make you an individual, because you are more than your caregiving role. You are still a human being with wants and needs and things that make you happy. And so that's a time where hopefully you can start to return to some of that. And also feeling greater confidence in advocacy and outreach efforts. Hopefully you now know who you need to talk to within the veterans treatment team, or which doorknobs to rattle until you get the right person that you need to talk to. knowing how to share with that treatment team, this is what's going on at home. Here's how I explain that so that I don't feel like I'm walking in blind. So hopefully that starts to develop some confidence and recognition that the work you do as a caregiver is a skill, and it's an important skill to have. Key caregiver needs, again, I grouped these a little bit. Self-care, a big one, continuing that need for self-care, and importantly, respite from caregiving. So it's really easy to say, well, we need you to take care of yourself. But in order to do that, you need a break from being a caregiver if you're going to take care of yourself. It's really hard to do that if you have no time to yourself. So respite is a big thing. Access to peer support. I have so many caregivers who tell me, you know what, it's wonderful to attend like the coaching and the support groups and the education that VA has, but it is just as important for me to sit down and have coffee with other caregivers and just talk about that. This is our veterans have their military brotherhood, so to speak, and we have our caregiving sisterhood. Now that's broadly spoken. Of course, we have male caregivers and female veterans, but when you have somebody who's been there, who's walked in similar shoes to you, that's very powerful. And time to spend with family outside of the stressors of caregiving. So recognition that your family is more than just your backup and your respite, and you are more than just that caregiver in that room. Caregiver recently was telling me about how she has 2 elementary school aged grandchildren, and they come over to her house for kind of grandma daycare after school. And she loves that. She loves being able to see them. She says, I would not give that up for anything. And I like that, you know, the way that her husband requires care allows her to do that, to spend that time with them. And she says, but you know what I would just love is if some days when they came home from school, we could just pack up and I could take them out to the park, or to, pick up some ice cream or something, and not have to be a caregiver for that time, not have to worry about getting my husband's shoes on and in the car and make sure that he's behaving appropriately if we're out in public and that kind of thing. So that's important to be able to have those important family identities as well. Work, if somebody's looking at re-entering the workforce, they're asking for support with that, as well as understanding and flexibility from their employers about what their role as a caregiver might require from them while they are at work. So accommodating that caregiving and finding a role that will accommodate that. And then in the caregiving role, support, making sure that you know that you have support in the event that a diagnosis or a care plan changes. So when those changes happen, you know who to talk to, and you know that somebody's going to be there for you. And ongoing recognition of that integral role in the care team that the caregiver plays in the care team. Comments, questions? Yeah.
I want to stress how much a caregiver support group helps. I've been in one for probably at least 8 of the 9 years since my husband was diagnosed. And it is a thing that then you're not alone. Learn from others. And kind of shifting over into that other experiences, I learned from the caregiver support group that I'm not going to lose myself.
Yeah.
Because so many, after they lost their loved one, they're like, I don't know what to do. And it's like, I'm not going to be that for somebody. Mm-hmm. I'm still hanging on to myself too.
Yeah. You learn from each other's struggles as well as their successes. So what works and what was not going well for somebody else that you want to make sure doesn't happen to you as well. Makes total sense. Other comments, questions? All right. So I want to move away from the caregiver journey map a little bit. Again, you can look at that in more depth on that website. It's an interactive map. It's great. But I want to talk a little bit about what the impact of caregiving looks like on caregivers. And again, this is probably going to be a little bit of preaching to the choir. You guys know what impact caregiving can have. But hopefully this will validate a little bit that what you were experiencing is normal and valid and reasonable, because caregiving is a hard job. So first of all, talking about the emotional side of caregiving, we have the gamut of emotions around here. What you might notice around these is these are oftentimes uncomfortable, or what we might think of as not bad emotions, but things that don't feel real good, right? Feeling ambivalent all the way to feeling anger or anxious or jealous or lonely. I mean, these are not comfortable emotions to experience, but they are all oftentimes a really common part of the caregiving experience. Now, this is not to say that the only emotions that caregiving can bring are negative ones. I hear really positive things a lot of times too. I love that I get to spend this time with him. You know, I am really proud of myself for what I accomplished as a caregiver for her. So there's a lot of really good things. We'll touch on those a little bit later, but I want to validate that these are all really normal and very commonly reported emotional signs of caregiving. This slide talks a lot about some signs of caregiver stress. Feeling burdened or worried all the time, feeling tired or sleeping too much or not enough, gaining or losing weight, becoming easily irritated, losing interest in activities you used to enjoy. So maybe you've got time to knit now, but it has no appeal anymore to go and sit down and knit, even if you have a break. Feeling sad, having headaches or other health problems, missing your own medical appointments. Now, if anybody has a background in mental health at all, you may look at this list and you might think, gosh, that sure looks like a diagnosis list for depression, doesn't it? And you know what? You're not wrong. That doesn't mean that every caregiver who has caregiver stress has depression, but it can look a lot like that. And in fact, 14.5% of caregivers in a study that was done by the CDC reported experiencing 14 or more days, mentally unhealthy days in the last month. So that's almost half of the month or more they were feeling mentally unhealthy. And 17.6 reported 14 or more physically unhealthy days in the past month. And I think it's, you know, pretty commonly understood that there's a pretty close link between physical and mental health, right? If your body's feeling run down and tired and icky, your mind is probably likely to get to that point too. And similarly, your mood very strongly impacts your body. And then you add to that more than a third of caregivers reported getting insufficient sleep. And it's kind of that's some shocking statistics there, I think, if you don't live that day in and day out. A couple comments here on military caregivers specifically that were done by a RAND study in 2014. But there is some notice that caregivers of individuals, veterans, or military service members, there is some greater strain reported, and it's kind of suspected that might be because veterans, because of the wear and tear that happens on their body and their mental health, oftentimes are needing caregiving at an earlier age. They might have more comorbidities or coexisting health and mental health disorders. But just some interesting points on military caregiving. Mental health impact of caregiving. So 40 to 70%, depending on what research you look at, 40 to 70% of caregivers experience symptoms of depression, with about a quarter of those caregivers meeting diagnostic criteria for major depression. So again, we look back to the signs of caregiver stress. Makes sense that that kind of looks like the diagnosis list for depression. We also see caregivers are shown to have increased alcohol and other substance use risk. Now, I really want to learn how to speak. I really want to draw your attention to the purple box here. The American Psychological Association, or excuse me, a CDC survey. It was a small survey, but it had some really shocking numbers. It showed that 30.7% of caregivers who were polled reported thinking seriously about suicide in the 30 days prior to that study. And when we say seriously, this is more than just like, I'm exhausted, I wish I didn't wake up tomorrow. This is like serious thoughts. And so I bring this up for a twofold purpose. The first being, if you are in groups with caregivers, support groups, if you know other caregivers, check in on. Know that caregivers are at a higher risk of having thoughts of suicide, and they might need that support, and it's okay to ask about it. It's a common misconception that if you ask somebody if they're having thoughts of suicide, that it's going to make them then more likely to die by suicide. That's a myth. Ask them, let them get some help them get help if you can. And it's also important for you to recognize yourself that if you're getting to a really dark place, it's time to reach out and ask for some help, because this is a risk that you may face as well. And we want to make sure nobody should have to live in that place where they're so unhappy that it feels like that's the way out. So it's kind of a scary and uncomfortable thing to talk about, but I say it for a very specific reason. So you can look out for each other and you can look out for yourself. Questions or comments on the mental health impact? Okay. Well, so then, as I mentioned, there are some positive impacts that caregivers report as well. This is another CDC study. Caregivers are reporting some increased self-confidence, and that could be because you have learned to figure out where your water shutoff is and fix your washing machine. It could be because you're now in charge of the finances. It could be because you're realizing you can get through some really tough stuff, right? So there's that increased self-confidence is there. You might feel fulfillment from helping others. There may be a lot of joy to being in that caregiving role. I hear that a lot from caregivers. That doesn't negate the fact that it can be a tough job, but you can love your job and recognize that it's tough. So establishing social networks or friendship groups associated with caregiving. Talked about your social or your support group, excuse me. People maybe you wouldn't have met if you hadn't been in that, connected with those folks. Yeah. So you might meet some wonderful lifelong friends through that, or people that are really going to be important to you for various reasons. Feeling needed and useful. I think we all like to feel useful on some level, right? We all want to feel needed. So this can kind of fulfill that for some folks. And also learning and developing those new skills. Anybody else have other positive things that have come out of their caregiving journey?
About systems that you have to go through.
Yeah, learning about those systems and kind of figuring out what the bigger picture looks like and how do I advocate? Absolutely. Yes. And sometimes it is just learning that I have to sit with being frustrated because there isn't anything I can do to change this, even though I know that something ain't right here. Right. I do want to make a really important note here about diverse caregiver groups, is that caregivers of different cultures, whether that may be, race, religion, sexual identity, gender identity, they experience the caregiving journey differently. And everybody in this room experiences it different, right? I mean, I can give you all of these pretty research numbers, but it's not everybody's going to fall nicely into those things. Some of the things in the caregiver journey might have made you nod your head like, yeah, I get that. And other ones would be like, are you absolutely nuts, Jeff? That doesn't sound right at all. And so it is important to recognize that diverse caregiver populations may have very different experiences with caregiving as a role and as a part of their life, whether it's something that's expected of them and they're just raised from birth knowing that they will be the one to care for the elders as they age, or, whether they're experiencing different hurdles in navigating systems as a caregiver, or they have different family, I guess, attitudes towards their caregiving. It's just important to keep that in mind, that everybody's situation is different. Oh, I didn't want to press stop. There we go. All right, so yeah, was there a question? Okay. Seeing things out of the corner of my eye. There we go. Okay, so this last piece is just kind of a quick plug for caregiver support at the VA. I won't go through all of this because there's a lot of it and we won't have time so that you guys can get out of here on time, but it is important to know that VA does have services for caregivers of veterans who are enrolled in the VA. So we have everything from coaching and skills training. You'll note the first one I have on there is Save for Caregivers, which is actually a suicide prevention training. We have online programs. We have text messaging based programs. We have things that you can do virtually live. We have things that you can do in person live. We have things that you can do virtually on your own time. We try and have a lot of different stuff that can fit your schedule and your needs. And in addition to that coaching and skills training and groups that we do, we also have individual support services, including helping folks navigate different community and VA services. One second. For those of you who are online, just please know I got an alert from my computer that my battery is running low. So if I suddenly disappear, you haven't missed a whole lot. We've kind of hit the rest of the training, but I will try and make it through before my battery dies. Figure they don't think, boy, that was rude. She just takes off. So we have two kind of pieces of our caregiver support program. The one that's most relevant to people is the program of general caregiver support services, or our core services, which are what I just talked about in the last slide here. Really, anybody who is supporting a veteran who is enrolled in VA, by and large, could be eligible for these services, and they are no cost to caregivers or veterans. There's not really like a application process or a huge in-depth assessment or anything. We do a quick intake to kind of understand what your situation is, and then we get you connected to services. Program of Comprehensive Assistance for Family Caregivers. This is providing some expanded services to caregivers of really our highest needs veterans. So, a veteran needs to have a 70% service-connected disability or higher to administratively qualify for this program. And then they need to meet some clinical eligibility criteria as well. So this does have a fairly intensive application process. However, we have case managers, social workers, and nurses within our program who help you walk through that process. All right, so the website here on top, the Caregiver Support Program website, is www.caregiver.va.gov. Or you can pull up, there's a little QR code there as well. This is a fabulous resource, even if you are not caring for a veteran. There's a ton of stuff on there, caregiver blogs, diagnosis fact sheets, medication logs, tons of stuff that may be helpful to anybody, regardless of whether you're a veteran or not. So that's a great thing to help. And if you are looking for more information on the VA Caregiver Support Program, our number here with the Caregiver Support Line is a good place to call if you don't know what your local Caregiver Support Program number is. They can get you connected. They can also just provide a listening ear, a shoulder to cry on for a little bit if you need that, if that's all you need. Squeaked it in right at the end. Any final questions? Nope. If they are eligible for VA care and they have established a provider, which means they've seen a veteran or a provider at least once a year, there needs to be, they sort of establish a clinical criteria so that there is a